Okay, guys, welcome to this presentation on having an impact with stories. Timon Renzelmann has an engineering background and a recent master's in sustainable energy engineering. For the last 3 to 4 years, alongside his academic studies, he has been exploring the science of narrative impact and what it means for positive impact. He also enjoys writing, reading, fiction, and is a keen tennis player. And so during this presentation, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the discussion, and we'll have a Q&A at the end. Thank you.
All right, welcome. So I'm going to talk a bit about stories and their impact. And as you're here, you're probably already aware that stories are more than just entertainment and fun, but they actually play a role in our lives, and they, in that sense that they actually influence us in quite some important ways. So I first give a quick intro on how stories influence, and then I give some ideas on what we can do so that this influence is actually a positive one. All right. So in order to understand the way stories influence our lives, we need to look beyond direct cause and effect relationships and think a bit bigger in systems. Because stories do not only influence individuals, but their relationships. And as Georg Gerbner puts it, quote, they weave the seamless web of the cultural environment that cultivates most of what we think, what we do, and how we conduct our affairs. And Tolstoy said, art is an affection. So stories can be infectious in that way, in that they really get communicated between individuals and have more of this larger impact on social systems, which go beyond just influencing individuals. What's quite interesting is that Dunilla Meadows, who wrote a book on thinking in systems and was quite an expert on systems thinking, in her book she basically describes some levers which can influence systems, and she ranked them in that way in which they generally, like the potential they have generally to change systems. So of course that depends on the system, but she basically says, okay, generally you can put them into this order. And what's quite interesting also in terms of stories is that two of the most important levers are goals and paradigms. So if you influence a goal of a system, that shapes the system as a whole, and basically that's the force which directs the system and what it does. And paradigms means the mindsets, the beliefs which gives rise to the goals. And just if you're interested, transcending paradigms means that if the system is unattached to certain paradigms, then this might be even more powerful. But for us, I think it's interesting to look at goals and paradigms, and I will explain what that has to do with stories in a minute. So this is an example of a story which had quite a big impact. So that's the book Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And in case you haven't heard of it, it was the second best-selling book of the 19th century, and it sold more than 300,000 books just in the first year. It influenced how people thought about slavery and the attitudes they had about slavery, because in the book there are slaves as characters. It played quite a significant role also in the War of Secession, and might have significantly impacted American history. And after some people who didn't want to change their mind about slavery criticized the book, the author wrote a second one in which she gave real-world examples and facts, basically trying to prove that she gave a realistic representation of slavery in her fictional story. And she also gives a good reason explaining why facts and figures might often not be enough to change people's minds, by saying that the atrocious and sacrilegious system of breeding human beings for sale and trading them like cattle on the market fails to produce the impression on the minds that it ought to produce because it's lost in generalities. It's like the account of a great battle, in which we learn in round numbers that 10,000 were killed and wounded and throw the paper by without a thought. Okay, coming back to Donilla Meadows, Thinking in Systems, the question is, okay, how do we actually change paradigms? And from this system thinking perspective, she says that system modelers say that we change paradigms by building a model of the system which takes us outside the system and forces us to see it whole. Okay, so that's all a lot. How does this connect? There are a couple of papers from researchers who are experts in narrative impact, and one of them is called The Function of Fiction is the Abstraction and Simulation of Social Experience. So what does it mean? They give the analogy of a flight simulator and basically say that stories are for us human beings what flight simulators are for pilots. So while a pilot might use a flight simulator to practice dangerous situations in a safe environment, or like learn how to fly in a safe environment without needing an actual plane, we human beings have stories in which we can basically train and simulate what matters for being a human, which is to a large extent social experience, because we're social mammals. So what we can take from that is that stories are kind of models or simulators, and when we engage with stories, we have this immersive emotional experience from which we learn. So we don't learn by arguments and reason, but we learn by engaging in a kind of simulative experience with this thing which is called a story. So I hope that this gives you some idea on the mechanism in which stories influence us. So yeah, that we update our mental models or what we know about the world by having these experiences with those stories. Okay, so what do stories influence? There's actually a ton of research showing that stories have an impact on all kinds of things, from attitudes, behaviors, social skills, how we think moralistically, our values, character traits. So they basically shape us in all kinds of ways, in basically any way you can imagine. And depending on how the stories are shaped, they have a different impact. So stories can contribute to violence and aggression, depending on how violence and aggression is depicted in the story. So that's actually context dependent. A movie like Schindler's List might have a completely different impact than Terminator, or one of the examples you can see here. Stories can also contribute to stereotypes when they associate certain groups with certain character traits or behaviors, or they can reduce stereotypes. So they are quite powerful. They can also have a positive impact. So also here there's a lot of stories. So stories can influence our attitudes towards nature. They can influence our attitudes towards contraceptive use. They can influence our intentions to quit smoking, or intentions and attitudes towards using sun protective behavior and equipment to prevent, for instance, skin cancer. Another example is the British Health, or the former British Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, admitted that the Hollywood movie Contagion influenced his response to COVID. So he said that it actually impacted him in a way that they ordered more vaccines earlier, and that they earlier thought about the order of priority of vaccination. And I don't know if you've seen the movie. I'm not even sure if I've seen it, but it's supposed to be quite a realistic depiction of how a pandemic could look like. All right, so now I'm going to talk about some ideas or concepts which are important for our goal that our story actually has a positive influence. The first factor might be kind of obvious. Okay, choose a relevant topic. So from an evolutionary point of view, we are interested in things that had or have evolutionary importance. So there are certain triggers, if you like violence or some romantic stories that might catch our attention. But if they are superficial, they might not actually provide us with a simulative experience that is enriching for our lives. So if we want to care about impact, we need to think, okay, it's not only interesting, but it matters. And that does not only mean that we have a topic like AI or pandemics and things like that, but it can also mean that it communicates something like compassion or kindness and so forth, and that it has some kind of depth about what it means to be a happy or a kind human being, and what leads to a functioning and positive society in a way. All right. Second, represent reality without distortion. So what do I mean by that? When we think about the flight simulator, we can wonder what makes a useful simulation. And the flight simulation is useful if it's accurate in representing how the plane behaves towards the controls and so on. I say it's important in terms of the vital causal connections. So they have to be represented accurately. If there might be some dinosaurs flying around in the simulation, that might not be bad, right? So there's room for fantasy. What does that mean in our story? So obviously, what makes a decent life is a bit more complicated than flying a plane. But there are differences in what's really matters and things that, like some fantasy creatures might walk around, but as long as the interaction between characters is depicted, and as long as what leads to suffering and what leads to well-being, as long as those causal connections are represented accurately, it's fine. And of course, there might be exaggerations for emphasis, which is okay. There might be intended distortions, which are obvious for comedic effect or satire. But if there's something which is distorted, which is not, which people don't get, that this might be misleading. So, for example, glorifying violence by not presenting risks or how it might cause harm. For example, misrepresenting some other risks. So we don't want to do that. What we want to do is to pay attention to our worldview and our values that we convey in the story. So what happens is that when we like characters, we are more likely to take over their values and attitudes and basically behave more like they would do. So if there's an attractive hero, then we don't want that hero to behave badly in a way in which might cause harm in reality. It's also a question how people are portrayed in general. Are they portrayed as being evil, like at heart, or good at heart, or is it a bit more complex? Another thing which is important is that our personal development and our own values and worldviews color our story. So what do I mean by that? When I was a teenager, I wrote a fantasy book, and I also read a lot of fantasy books. And when I worked with the topic I'm talking about today, I was like, okay, let's have a look. What kind of stuff have I written about? And I'd actually discovered that I included some glorifications of violence, if you like, or this like good and evil themes in my story unintentionally, just because I took that from all the books I have read. So if you want to tell stories which are impactful, it also matters that you reflect on what you have consumed yourself and the kind of values that you think are important. So in that way, personal reflection and development, if you like, also matter. Okay, so this is also a really important point. What stories can do is they can expand our circle of care. So most people Maybe the percentage is a bit higher within EA circles. But most people are not motivated by reason alone, but by a certain emotional connection to a topic. And when we have stories, we can help create such a connection. So this is also what the book Harriet Beecher Stowe did, which I talked about in the beginning. It created a connection to slaves as a group by giving you an example of certain characters, and therefore expanded the circle of care, because suddenly there was an emotional connection to this kind of suffering, if you like. So what you can do is you can basically try to create a connection to groups that are minorities or groups that are suffering, which might be unseen. And the example here is from the movie or the series Our Planet. There's a similar one in, I think, Blue Planet 2. And it's an example of how plastic pollution impacts seabirds, or more precisely albatross. And they basically tell a story about these cute little albatross chicks and how they are impacted by plastic pollution. And by doing that, they can create an emotional connection to the topic, which actually might make you care more. I talked about make me care, and this now is more about make me think. So stories obviously need some kind of conflict to be interesting. If it's just a happy fairy tale and everything is fine and nothing is happening, wouldn't be so interesting. There need to be some kind of conflict, can be physical conflict, can be emotional or ethical conflict. And what really matters is how the conflict is presented and what leads to the conflict in the first place and what solves the conflict. So if, for instance, there's some kind of conflict, which might be violent, and then the hero just beats up the bad guy and everyone is happy, the question could be, would that work in the real world? Probably not, I would guess, because everyone would think they would be the hero. So giving systemic reasons for why conflicts arise and how they can be solved might be more useful in terms of what that might teach us. And stories can also explore difficult ethical terrain by basically giving us scenarios to explore, and by that kind of challenging our own ethical views and giving us some kind of mean for looking into potential futures. So while stories can't predict the future, they might be able to inspire it. Yeah, and the quote, to not forget that, is that the purpose of a storyteller is not to tell you how to think, but to give you questions to think upon. So in other words, the goal is not to do some kind of positive propaganda and force people to think a certain way, but more to provide them with useful simulations which accurately represent what leads to well-being, what leads to suffering, and therefore give them the opportunities to learn in a way which is useful for them and those beings they relate to. Right. So there are certain factors that moderate the size of the impact. So the first factor is immersion, or there are different words in the scientific literature. It's also called narrative engagement and comprehension, or transportation into the story, or entrancement. So you get the idea. It's basically how much you are immersed in the story and how much you forget about anything around you. And there are certain things which promote immersion, which is an interest in the topic. So you might have a visible benefit. Knowledge relevant to the story. So if you're an expert on pandemics, you might be more inclined to dive into the movie Contagion, for instance. Aesthetics also matters. And that's important that we don't forget that, because stories are also artistic. And it's very difficult to put into like clear mechanics how to make something artistic, right? So the quality of how people say how artistic or how aesthetic a story is also impacts them in terms of how they are immersed in the story. Another thing is realistic appearance. So realistic appearance is not only important for the impact of the story, but also for how much we engage with the story. So if we are like, okay, this is bullshit, then we might not dive as much into it as if it appears to be realistic. And of course, situational factors also matter. So if we're in a quiet environment, we might have more capacity to enjoy a story than if it's like noisy everywhere. That's similar maybe to like your experience when drinking a wine. You like to have a nice ambiente, and then the wine tastes better. And at the same time, it's also the reputation of the story that matters. So what other people say and think about the story influences how you relate to it. Okay, second, we are social creatures, so our relationship to the characters matter. If we like them, if we can identify with them, we are more likely to take over the attributes. If that's not the case, if we hate a character, it might be the opposite effect. So here it's important to make characters relatable, realistic, three-dimensional, and not just have like a really simple kind of perfect superhero that might actually be not relatable. And finally, the emotional flow, which is, in other words, the evolution of your emotional experience while engaging the story. So I don't remember who was the source of this quote, but someone said, a good story should make you laugh and then break your heart in the next moment. All right, so what can you do if you care about stories? First, connect with other storytellers and exchange ideas, maybe work together even. There's a quite active group which is called Film and TV in the EA Anywhere Slack, which I can recommend. Second, raise your voice and respond to the stories you encounter. As I said, that moderates the impact they have. So if you see something which is off, be not afraid to tell so. It might actually be important. Also consider what kind of stories you spread. Are they inspirational? Do they communicate values? Do they promote or motivate people to do good? And of course, be mindful of your own story consumption, because if you like it or not, you're all influenced by the stories you're surrounded with. Tell more valuable stories, and finally, if you have more questions, ask them. I don't think we have much more time now, but there's also office hours, and you can contact me. I'm happy to share more. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so we do have some questions. Let's start with the first one. What stories would you like to see being told in creative ways? What stories are worth telling?
So I think generally every story that communicates positive values matters. I think it's important that we have depth in stories, that it's not just some superficial stuff, but it's actually something which can move you in a way, because that might also inspire you. Obviously, more good stories about risk from AI or pandemics and so forth, I think that can be really valuable.
Okay. Video games often have quite violent stories, yet there is, to the best of my knowledge, little evidence that this actually increases violence. What are the limits of how stories influence our behavior?
I've read some articles which actually say that aggressive video games or violent video games can increase aggression, but it also depends on the individual. So if someone has like really grounded values and is more like a calm person and so on, they might be less impacted than individuals which are sensation-seeking, for instance, or which are younger or have a less maybe strong social network. So if people are more vulnerable, the effect might be much higher. But I'm not a fan of violent video games, so that's my view on it.
All right, and the last question. Writing about future or rare risks, do you see risks in not being able to depict them realistically due to uncertainty, how they will play out?
That's a very good question. So the topic of uncertainty is the long one, so I don't know if I can put that in a nutshell. Because we don't know every effect, right? Some effects might be uncertain, so how do we do that in a story? Ultimately, I think that competent storytellers or creative storytellers can communicate risks without having to have that outcome in the story, right? And it's also about probability, and then you can think, okay, ultimately you want to care about the impact the simulation has or the story has on those who experience it. So you might need to consider that when thinking about improbable or uncertain effects. But I don't have a magic answer to this. This is actually something one needs to think about.
Okay, thank you. And we will now go up to office hours room 1 on the first floor if you have more questions. See you there.